The 7th of October 1943, mid-Pacific, 2,300 hours. Night had swallowed the Pacific whole. The sea stretched into a black, endless void, silent, cold, and watching. Far from any map, far from any friendly shore, 1,000 miles of dark water separated the world of the living from the world of the forgotten. And somewhere in that darkness, Japan waited. Engines muted. Radios off. Steel hulls drifting like ghosts. An entire strike group buried beneath the shadows of the night, invisible even to the moon. Japan had chosen this night carefully. The currents were weak. The winds are unpredictable. And the sky, heavy with clouds, turned the Pacific into a perfect hunting ground. Inside the narrow submarines and destroyers, Japanese sailors breathed in the scent of oil and iron, their hands trembling over torpedo triggers. They whispered silent prayers to ancestors, to the emperor, and to the sea itself, because tonight's mission was one no logbook would ever officially record. Across the water, unseen and unaware, a U.S. convoy moved steadily through the black waves. Cargo ships. Escorts. Ammunition carriers. Dark outlines sliding across a corridor they believed was safe. No alarms. No warnings. No reason to fear what waited beneath them. But Japan knew. Japan had been tracking them for days, reading their speed, their routes, and their weaknesses. And tonight, the hunters and hunted were now only minutes apart. This wasn't just an attack. It wasn't revenge. It was something far greater, Japan's desperate attempt to break the tightening American grip on the Pacific before it was too late. Japan was about to unleash an ambush so precise, so silent, that by dawn, an entire U.S. convoy would simply vanish from the face of the earth. The night of the 7th of October, 1943 had not been chosen by accident. In Tokyo, days earlier, the Imperial naval staff had pored over intercepted radio fragments and weather maps spread across long wooden tables. A U.S. convoy, one carrying ammunition, fuel, and replacement troops, had entered a Pacific corridor that Japan had once controlled with ease. But now, with the tide turning against them, Japan needed a strike powerful enough to unsettle American confidence and remind the Pacific that these waters were still contested. From the moment the first coded message arrived, the decision was made, a hidden ambush, executed far from friendly shores, by crews who understood that they might never return. Aboard the submarine I-176, Lieutenant Commander Aritomo Kawai stood silently in the cramped control room, listening to the low hum of the electric motors. The submarine glided silently just below the surface, its periscope raised only a hair above the waves. Kawai's eyes, trained through years of discipline, scanned the distant silhouettes. The crew around him were tense but disciplined. They had lived through endless nights like this, but this one felt heavier. There was something in the air, something final. They all knew it. But Japan was hiding something even darker. Hundreds of meters behind them, two more submarines shadowed the same U.S. corridor, their positions aligned with mathematical precision. And further west, near the outer edge of the moonless horizon, three Japanese destroyers waited with engines idle, drifting like wolves in tall grass. These ships had been outfitted for silence, reduced light, muted exhausts, and gunners ordered not to speak above a whisper. Every sailor knew their role: hold until the signal, strike once, and disappear before the Americans even understood what hit them. Inside destroyer Shiga, Captain Tomoichi Hara felt the tension in every plank of the ship. He had been ordered to lead the surface element of the ambush, an assignment that carried both honor and the weight of a potential suicide mission. Hara reviewed the convoy's expected course again and again, tracing his finger across the navigation chart lit by a single dim lamp. He knew that if even one American escort spotted them early, the entire operation could collapse into chaos. And chaos meant death. The sea, however, was on Japan's side tonight. Thick clouds smothered the starlight. The moon struggled behind a curtain of drifting vapor. The distant rumble of waves masked the low throb of Japanese engines. Nature had become an accomplice, cold, indifferent, but perfectly aligned with Japan's intention. This moment changed everything. Shortly after 2300 hours, a faint vibration reached the hull of I-176. Commander Kawai lifted the headphones from the sonar operator's trembling hands and listened. Rhythmic, steady, unmistakable. Propellers, several of them, cutting through the water at a uniform pace. The Americans were close. Kawai felt the breath leave his chest. The convoy was larger than expected. He signaled for silence. Every light in the control room dimmed. The crew waited, barely breathing, while the sonar pulses grew stronger and clearer. Merchant engines. Escort hull slicing water. The distant churn of a fuel carrier. The soundscape of an entire moving city. The Americans had no idea they were drifting straight into a trap. A coded light flickered through the periscope, Shiga's signal, faint but unmistakable. The surface squadron had visual contact with the silhouettes. A second flash confirmed they were holding fire until the sub struck first. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, at the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo, Admiral Osamu Nagano stood beside a map of the Pacific pinned across an enormous wall. He knew the regional balance was fragile. The Americans were pushing hard in the Solomon Islands. Pressure mounted in the Central Pacific. Resources were stretched thin. A permanent shift in momentum threatened Japan's very survival. Nagano knew that every successful convoy destroyed meant bought time of days, weeks, sometimes months. And sometimes, a single ambush could change the psychological rhythm of a war. In the deep sea, the ambush formation tightened. Commander Kawai finally spotted them, black shadows moving in formation, steady and predictable. The lead American escort cut through the darkness at the front. Behind it, 3 cargo ships followed in a staggered pattern. Behind those, a fuel tanker trailed heavily, and 2 smaller escorts guarded the rear. The convoy looked confident, disciplined, and unaware. Japan had hunted them for days. Now they were within striking distance. No one was prepared for what came next. Kawai quietly issued orders. Torpedo tubes flooded. Depth set. Angle adjusted. The crew moved like a single machine, no emotion, no hesitation, just training etched into muscle. In the torpedo room, bare-chested sailors whispered final prayers into the warm, oily air. Every Japanese submarine had the same silent understanding. Fire once. Reload fast. Disappear faster. Surface crews aboard Shiga braced themselves. Hara, through binoculars, measured the convoy's distance by the faint, almost invisible tremors of light reflecting off waves. One miscalculation, one premature engine noise, or one accidental glint could expose them early. But the Pacific remained mercifully dark. Then, at 0:14 hours, the U.S. convoy altered its speed slightly, a minor correction in course, almost insignificant. But Kawai saw it. He whispered 2 words. Fire, 1. A sudden jolt shook the submarine as the first torpedo tore into the black water, leaving behind a trail that no human eye could see in the darkness. Moments later, a second torpedo followed. On the surface, Hara saw the faint plume and felt the blood in his veins turn cold. This was it. The ambush had begun. The torpedoes sped silently through the freezing black water, their wakes hidden beneath the rolling waves. Inside IA-176, every sailor stood frozen in place, listening, not with ears, but with instinct. The first 10 seconds after firing always felt like standing on the edge of life and death. The ocean held its breath. The crew held theirs. And Kawai watched the periscope without blinking. Somewhere on the surface, somewhere in the darkness, steel and fate were racing toward each other. A heartbeat passed. Then another. Then. A faint, distant thud traveled through the water like a pulse against the hull. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a muffled crack. But every Japanese man aboard the submarine knew exactly what that sound meant. A hit. Not just contact, impact. The shockwave rolled gently across the Pacific and into the bones of every sailor. Someone in the control room whispered Tenno Hika Banzai under his breath. Kawai lowered the periscope and allowed a single exhale to escape his lips, not relief, focus. There was more to do. On the surface, Captain Hara saw it before he heard it. A burst of orange light blinked at the edge of the horizon, swallowed instantly by darkness. The first American cargo ship had taken the hit near midships. Its silhouette lurched violently, listing to one side. A disturbed glow shimmered across the waves as flames began licking the deck. The convoy scattered in confusion. Searchlights snapped on like white daggers slicing the night. But Japan had only just begun. American escorts immediately broke formation. One destroyer rushed toward the explosion, cutting the waves with frantic precision. Another swept its beams left and right, searching desperately for a submarine's periscope or a flash of a torpedo wake. The Americans had been trained for ambushes, but not for this. Not for the complete silence, the total darkness, the absence of warnings. Beneath the surface, I-176 angled downward sharply. Convoy wanted to vanish before the Americans could triangulate their position. But even as they dived, he heard the metallic clank of the torpedo room preparing the next volley. The crew worked in suffocating heat and darkness, sweat rolling down their backs, the smell of grease and seawater filling the cramped compartment. They were ready for another shot. On the horizon, Shiga and her sister destroyers came alive. Hara barked out orders. Engines roared. The destroyers surged forward, closing the gap toward the U.S. convoy. Hara knew they had only minutes, maybe less, before the Americans regrouped. This had to be fast. Brutal. Precise. The Japanese formation split cleanly. One destroyer charged toward the front escort to draw fire. The second angled toward the wounded cargo ship, seeking a close-range torpedo kill. Shiga herself slipped diagonally across the convoy's flank, the perfect position to launch her much-feared Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, Japan's deadliest secret of the Pacific. These weren't ordinary weapons. They were faster, more powerful, and traveled farther than anything the Americans had. And tonight, in these black waters, they would be devastating. Hara's gunners moved like ghosts. No shouting. No panic. Just silent coordination. The torpedo tubes rotated smoothly, locking into firing position. Open outer doors, Hara ordered quietly. The destroyer's steel hull vibrated as the mechanisms aligned. Hara watched the convoy through binoculars, American sailors scrambling, alarms blaring, officers shouting over the thunder of shells and explosions. The scene was chaos. Perfect chaos. He raised his hand. Fire. Shiga's torpedoes erupted into the water, invisible missiles knifing through the dark. The destroyer recoiled slightly from the launch, then accelerated to full speed, carving a black arc across the waves. Hara wanted distance before the Americans understood what had happened. The ocean was about to erupt again. Seconds later, a massive explosion ripped through the night. This time it wasn't faint. This time it wasn't subtle. This time the Pacific itself seemed to convulse. The fuel tanker had been hit. Fire shot up like a pillar, turning the night sky blood orange. The tanker's hull split open, vomiting burning fuel into the sea. Flames raced across the surface, carried by wind and waves, turning the Pacific into a spreading inferno. The Americans panicked, trying to maneuver their ships away from the burning slick, but the fire moved faster than steel could. One escort destroyer swung wide, attempting to flank the Japanese attackers. Its captain ordered depth charges drop blindly, hoping to hit whatever submarine had started this nightmare. Columns of water exploded upward, drenching the decks. But the Japanese were already shifting positions. Beneath the waves, Convoy monitored the American counterattack through sonar. He heard the explosions and felt the vibrations, but he knew they weren't close. The U.S. destroyers were guessing. Fear made men rush. Rush made men miss. Convoy decided this was the moment to strike again. "Prepare to," he whispered. The submarine steadied at attack depth. The men braced themselves, gripping pipes and rails. The oily water around them tightened with pressure. The ocean, dark and unforgiving, closed in like a giant fist. Fire. 2 more torpedoes surged forward. They slammed into the trailing American escort. A deafening roar rolled through the water. The escort's stern lifted out of the sea before plunging downward again. Metal screeched. Bulkheads ruptured. Men screamed as the ship snapped into 2 jagged halves. Above, Hara saw the escort split, and even in the chaos, he felt a moment of grim astonishment. Japan had never executed an ambush this cleanly. This silently. This is brutally efficient. But it wasn't over. Something even more catastrophic was coming. The remaining cargo ships tried to flee, zigzagging through burning water. But the Pacific betrayed them, currents pushed them toward the spreading wall of flame. The remaining American escort attempted to shield the largest merchant vessel, firing its guns wildly into the night. But firing at shadows only fed the chaos. Shiga's sister destroyer charged in again, launching another long lance spread. 1 torpedo missed. 1 ran too deep. The 3rd struck the American flagship cargo vessel near the bow. The ship groaned like a dying beast, its front half lifting as tons of seawater poured inside. Men dived into the flaming ocean, trying to escape the collapsing deck. But the darkness and flames offered no mercy. Only 1 ship remained untargeted, the last escort destroyer, circling desperately, trying to save survivors while hunting ghosts. It was alone. Blind. Terrified. Hara watched it through binoculars and understood that the final move belonged to the ocean, not to him. The lone surviving American escort destroyer surged back and forth through the flaming corridor, its captain shouting frantic orders as the sea around him burnt like a floating inferno. The heat rising from the water was unbearable, waves of fire rippled across the surface, fed by leaking fuel. The ship's searchlight stabbed through smoke, cutting desperate tunnels of brightness in the choking darkness. But nothing revealed the Japanese attackers. The Americans weren't fighting enemies, they were fighting ghosts. Deep beneath them, Commander Kawai listened carefully as the broken echoes of American propellers bounced off underwater ridges. The escort was moving erratically, unsure of direction, its confusion amplified by the flames above. Kawai knew this was the most dangerous moment. An enemy cornered by terror often fought with reckless force. But that same fear also created predictable patterns. And predictable patterns were exactly what the Japanese submarine crews had been trained to exploit. The submarine glided silently through the dark water, electric motors humming like distant insects. The men held their breath, trying to interpret every sonar ping, every vibration, every pulse in the hull. They had no windows, no view of the carnage above, only their instruments and instinct. Yet the tension inside the submarine felt electric, alive. But Japan sensed the battle was shifting. On the surface, Captain Hara aboard Shiga steadied himself against the railing, the wind carrying the stench of burning oil into his face. The sea glowed unnaturally beneath him, orange flames streaking across black waves, sparks leaping with every gust of wind. The Pacific looked less like water and more like molten metal. Hara had seen battles, but he had never seen the ocean itself transformed into a weapon. His eyes flicked toward the final American escort. It had become erratic, panicked, alternating between trying to rescue survivors and firing blindly into the night. Hara could almost feel the confusion radiating from the enemy captain. But there was something else, something far more concerning. The American ship wasn't just firing randomly, it was calling for reinforcements. Across the water, the destroyer's radio mast pulsed faint, frantic flashes, Morse code, hurried and uneven. The Americans were signaling for help. Hara gritted his teeth. If reinforcements arrived, everything Japan had built tonight, every step of the ambush, would be undone. He turned sharply toward his signal officer. Intercept that transmission. Now. The officer adjusted dials, listening to the fragmented static. Within seconds, he confirmed it. It is a distress call, Captain. They are requesting immediate support. Hara didn't hesitate. All ships, prepare for Phase 2. Beneath the waves, Kawai received the coded pulse just moments later. Phase 2 meant one thing: finish the job before American help arrived, then vanish without a trace. Kawai nodded to himself. The mission was entering its final, most dangerous stage. IE-176 rose slowly toward periscope depth. The steel hull creaked under shifting pressure. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like cold sweat. The crew watched Kawai closely as he lifted the periscope, turning it through clouds of smoke drifting across the water. When he finally caught sight of the American escort, his breath tightened. The destroyer was closer than expected, much closer. And it wasn't just searching anymore. It was charging straight toward the Japanese position. Kawai knew instantly what was happening. The American captain had decided to commit to a desperate run, sprint through the flames, guess the submarine's position, and drop depth charges directly overhead. It was a suicide play, but a potentially deadly one. Kawai's heartbeat slowed. His voice remained calm. "Make ready. Stand by for collision course." The helmsman gripped the controls. The torpedo crew prepared tubes silently. The entire submarine shifted into a controlled readiness that only came from years of discipline. The next seconds would decide everything. Above, flames cast long shadows across Shiga's deck. Captain Hara watched the American destroyer racing ahead, bow slicing through smoke as if trying to escape hell itself. He could almost admire the bravery, almost. But this battlefield had no room for admiration. Only survival. Only victory. Only duty. He raised his binoculars again, tracking the destroyer's wake. Something about its trajectory felt wrong. Too direct. Too confident. Then realization struck him like a blow. "They're aiming for one of our submarines," he whispered. Before he could signal a warning, the American ship unleashed the first volley of depth charges. Great columns of water erupted upward, silhouetted against fire. The explosions rumbled across the Pacific like distant earthquakes. The flames flickered wildly. For a moment, the entire sea seemed to shake. Inside IE-176, the shockwave slammed against the hull so hard that pipes rattled and gauges trembled. Men grabbed whatever they could to keep themselves steady. Kawai didn't flinch. He waited. He listened. He felt the rhythm of the American attack. Depth charges weren't random. Americans always fired them in patterns, hoping one would hit by chance. Kawai knew those patterns. He had studied them for years. Another explosion. Then another. Then three in rapid succession. The submarine rocked violently. Lights flickered. A burst valve somewhere hissed sharply before a crewman sealed it. Sweat dripped down faces. Not from heat, from fear. But Kawai remained still. He had one chance, one window, one precise angle. He waited for the destroyer to complete its curve, waited for the captain above to assume his target had been hit. The sonar operator suddenly whispered, "Passing overhead." That was the moment. Kawai lowered the periscope. Up 10 degrees, steady, fire. The torpedo launched with a muffled roar, vanishing into black water. It angled upward, homing directly toward the destroyer's underside. On the surface, Captain Hara saw it unfold in a heartbeat. The American destroyer completed its depth charge run, then slowed, likely expecting to hear the crushing silence of a destroyed submarine. Instead, the ocean beneath it detonated. A towering explosion split the seas. The destroyer's entire midsection blew outward, fire erupting like a volcanic plume. The ship broke apart almost instantly, metal folding, collapsing, sinking into flaming water. The roar echoed across the night sky, mixing with screams, with fire, with the snapping of steel. And then, silence. The last American ship was gone. The convoy had no escorts left. No protection. No hope. Japan had won, but the night was not finished with them yet. Burning debris floated on the waves. The survivors struggled in the fire-lit water. And in the distance, far, far away, Hara noticed something faint on the horizon. Lights. Multiple lights. Moving fast. Reinforcements. American reinforcements. Japan had minutes, only minutes, to escape before the trap turned on the hunters. The distant lights on the horizon grew brighter with each passing second, tiny sparks at first, then clearer, sharper, white pinpoints of American searchlights carving through the darkness. Even from miles away, Captain Hara could tell these weren't drifting fishing boats or misdirected patrols. This was a full U.S. response force rushing toward the burning corridor, pushed by urgency, anger, and desperation. The Pacific, which had moments earlier belonged entirely to Japan, now threatened to drown them beneath a rising tide of enemy steel. Hara didn't waste a second. The wind whipped across Shiga's deck as he shouted, "All ships, full retreat pattern Delta. Now!" His voice carried a hardened edge that sliced through the roar of burning water. The signal lamps flashed the retreat code across the smoke-filled sea. The surviving Japanese destroyers accelerated instantly, engines rumbling as they pivoted sharply, turning their bows away from the firestorm they had created. Below the waves, Commander Kawai received the same retreat code via low-frequency pulse. He didn't hesitate. "All ahead full. Take us deeper." The submarine eased downward, the hull groaning softly as water pressure increased. Shadows rippled across the steel walls like dark spirits watching silently. The men moved with practiced precision, adjusting valves, tightening seals, and ensuring their vessel became a ghost once more, silent, invisible. But retreat was never simple in the Pacific. The flames above cast shifting light that danced across the water's surface, creating chaotic reflections that could expose a submarine's periscope. Oil slicks drifted unpredictably. Exploding ammunition from sinking ships continued to crack the air, sending shockwaves across the sea that masked the sound of incoming threats. And the Americans were moving fast. Japan had minutes, maybe less, before the hunters became the hunted. On the horizon, the newest U.S. destroyers powered forward, their bows cutting through the black waves with ferocious determination. They must have picked up the convoy's distress call only minutes after the ambush began. And now, with fuel tanks full and guns loaded, they approached the burning corridor like wolves answering a wounded pack's cry. Hara tightened his grip on the binoculars. The distance between his retreating ships and the American reinforcements shrank with frightening speed. The burning tanker behind him illuminated the sea like a floating torch, making the Japanese destroyers stand out more clearly against the horizon. They were no longer hidden. They were exposed. Illuminated by their own victory. He snapped toward his helmsman. "Run us into the dark. Turn starboard, angle us behind the smoke." If they could slip behind the thickets of black smoke rolling across the water, they might buy time. The flames were slowing, collapsing into smoldering craters, but the smoke remained thick, heavy, oily, perfect for concealment. The destroyers angled sharply, engines whining as they cut through waves. Smoke swallowed them within seconds, hiding their silhouettes and dimming their wake. But even hidden, Hara knew the Americans would press forward, firing star shells, illuminating the sea like artificial daylight. He needed more than darkness. He needed misdirection. "Deploy smoke canisters," he ordered. Small devices were hurled into the water behind the destroyers. They burst into plumes of thick white fog that mixed with the natural smoke, creating a swirling labyrinth of haze stretching across hundreds of meters. Any American ship charging into that cloud would be blind, dangerously blind. Hara's plan was simple: hide the destroyers, confuse the enemy, and force them to slow down. Meanwhile, beneath the burning remains of the convoy, Kawai steered IA-176 through underwater slopes and ridges. The submarine advanced deeper into the cold, black emptiness, where the ocean absorbed all sound and movement. Only the hum of machinery echoed faintly through the hull. The crew monitored sonar readings with unwavering focus, listening for approaching engines. For a moment, the water grew unnervingly quiet. Then a sharp, rhythmic vibration sliced through the sonar, a low, steady beat that grew louder every second. American destroyers. Multiple. They were approaching from the east, closing the distance rapidly. Kawai gritted his teeth. If the Americans deployed sonar pings, the submarine would be revealed. If they dropped depth charges in pattern runs, survival would depend purely on instinct and luck. He turned to his navigator. Angle 40 degrees west. Follow the seafloor ridge. Reduce all engine noise to minimum. He wanted I-176 to blend into the ocean itself, to become indistinguishable from the rocks below. The Americans were close enough to feel. On the surface, Hara's destroyers burst free from the smoke cloud just as the first American illumination shells arced overhead. White flares exploded in the sky, drenching the sea in harsh, blinding light. The burning convoy wreckage vanished beneath brilliant reflections. Waves glittered like silver blades. But the Japanese ships had already disappeared into the darkness beyond. The American guns roared, shells crashing into the water where the destroyers had been moments earlier. Salvos burst around them, geysers of saltwater soaring into the air. The ocean boiled with explosions. One Japanese destroyer took a near hit, shrapnel showered across the deck, slicing through ropes and breaking railing. A crewman screamed as debris tore his shoulder. Yet the ship kept moving. Hara clenched his jaw. Do not return fire. We cannot reveal our position. Stay silent. Stay dark. They ran like shadows, chased by lightning. Behind them, the American destroyers pushed harder, their captains furious, their engines screaming as they pursued the scent of Japanese aggression. The night reverberated with the thunder of their guns. But in their rage, they made a fatal mistake. They entered the smoke cloud. Within seconds, visibility dropped to zero. Their searchlights could barely penetrate the dense haze. Waves slapped violently against their hulls. The burning wreckage distorted the air with heat and fumes. Their formation broke as the lead ship slowed suddenly, forcing the others to adjust erratically. Hara used the chaos. Full left rudder. Take us behind the ridge of flames. Shiga slipped between the last remnants of fire and the shadow of the drifting smoke, sliding into a narrow, almost invisible channel of darkness. To the Americans, it was as if the Japanese destroyers had simply dissolved into the sea. Below, Kauai continued his silent retreat, trusting that the ocean silence would protect them. But then, a sudden metallic ping echoed through the hull. Active sonar. The Americans had begun sweeping the depths. Kauai's face hardened. Hold course. Maintain silence. Another ping. Closer. Then another. Even closer. The submarine drifted along the seafloor ridge like a shadow clinging to stone. The crew didn't breathe. Minutes felt like hours. And then? The sonar pings began to drift away. They had passed. They had survived the sweep. But Kauai knew something the other men didn't. This wasn't luck. This wasn't safety. This was only the beginning of the escape. Japan had slipped the noose, but the night still had one more twist to give. The smoke thinned as dawn crept across the Pacific, turning the blackened horizon into a muted canvas of gray and fading orange. The fires from the destroyed American convoy sputtered weakly now, mere embers flickering atop oil-black waves. Ash drifted across the surface like fallen snow. The night that had belonged to Japan was ending, and the morning, quiet, pale, and cold, carried the weight of what had been done. Aboard Shiga, Captain Hara stood on the bridge, the wind brushing flecks of soot from his uniform. His face, hardened by years of war, showed no triumph, only a deep, layered fatigue. Victory on the sea was never simple, never clean. It came with ghosts. The Pacific kept them all. He watched his remaining destroyers regroup in the distance, damaged, scorched, but alive. Their silhouettes crept across the water like wounded predators slipping back into their territory. Hara lowered the binoculars and exhaled slowly. They had done the impossible, struck fast, struck precisely, and escaped under the nose of American reinforcements. But even in victory, he knew the truth. Japan had won a battle. Not the war. But the real cost of the ambush was only beginning to show. Below the waves, Commander Kauai guided I-176 through the last stretch of their retreat path. The submarine moved at a cautious crawl, engines humming softly. The men inside were exhausted, eyes sunken, hands trembling, uniforms soaked in sweat. Their nerves had been stretched to the breaking point, held together only by discipline and the quiet belief that loyalty demanded endurance. As they traveled deeper into Japanese-held waters, Convoy finally permitted the men to rest in shifts. Some collapsed onto bunks without removing their boots. Others sat against the steel walls, staring blankly into the dim red lights of the control room. A few whispered prayers of gratitude. Others whispered apologies to the ocean for surviving when others had not. Convoy himself did not rest. He remained at the periscope station long after they had left the danger zone, watching the rippling patterns of dawn on the water's surface. The light of morning made the Pacific look deceptively peaceful, gentle waves, drifting fog, calm horizons. But beneath that calm lay wreckage, bodies, oil, and metal from a battle that had lasted less than an hour yet had rewritten the night. He lowered the periscope and allowed himself a single breath, a breath not of relief, but of reflection. Japan had struck with precision, skill, and deadly silence. The U.S. convoy had been wiped out before it ever realized the scale of the danger. But Convoy also understood the larger truth: each victory pushed the Americans to fight harder, smarter, and faster. Japan's enemies were vast in number and vast in industry. The ocean was growing tighter around Japan's borders, like a coil being pulled slowly shut. He wondered how many such nights remained for them. Japan had won, but it had also awakened a sleeping giant's fury. On Shiga, Hara assembled his senior officers in the wardroom. The lantern light flickered as he unrolled a new map, one showing updated American movements across the Central Pacific. Arrows, dates, radio intercepts, all pointing to one reality: American forces were gathering strength across multiple fronts. Japan's victory tonight would be a sharp sting, yes, but not a wound deep enough to slow the American advance for long. Hara traced one line with the tip of his finger. "They will answer this," he said quietly. "Harder than we expect." One officer asked, "Sir, was it worth it?" Hara paused. Was it worth it? Any admiral in Tokyo would say yes. Any strategist studying supply lines would say yes. Any soldier fighting in New Guinea or the Solomons, desperate for breathing room, would say yes. But Hara, who had seen the burning men in the water, who had heard the steel scream, who had watched the ocean swallow both enemy and countrymen alike, did not answer quickly. He finally said, "The sea decides what is worth it." The officers lowered their eyes. Everyone in the room felt the truth of his words. Meanwhile, Ein 176 broke the surface at last, its conning tower rising into the morning air. Fresh wind flooded the interior as the hatch opened. Sailors climbed onto the deck, blinking at the sunlight. Some smiled weakly. Others simply stared at the horizon, letting the breeze cool their faces. Convoy emerged last, stepping into the daylight with a calm heaviness. He looked toward the distant smoke trails far behind them, the only remaining trace of the night's violence. For a moment, the commander allowed himself a brief silence, honoring both the Japanese lives saved and the American lives taken. It was not a triumph. It was not remorse. It was simply the reality of war. He turned to his crew. "Set course for truck. Maintain radio silence until confirmation." The men saluted sharply and returned to their stations. Japan had escaped, but the shadow of the night would follow them. By the time the surviving Japanese ships reached safer waters, word of the ambush had already begun creeping through the chain of command. Whispered first in coded transmissions, then repeated in mess halls, then recorded in guarded reports. Tokyo received the summary through an encrypted channel: a decisive strike, total destruction of the enemy convoy, and minimal Japanese losses. Admiral Nagano read the final line of the report twice, adjusting his glasses. The victory was undeniable. The precision is remarkable. The effect is significant. But it also revealed something deeper. Japan was fighting a war of time. Every successful ambush bought hours or days, but the enemy produced ships and planes faster than Japan could sink them. Nagano folded the report and looked out over Tokyo's distant skyline, illuminated by the first rays of sunlight. "What have we gained?" he murmured. "And what will it cost us?" History would answer. Far out on the Pacific, Shiga and I-176 continued toward their base, two small silhouettes sailing across an ocean that was rapidly changing. The men aboard them felt pride, fear, honor, uncertainty, all mixed into a quiet storm beneath their disciplined faces. They had struck perfectly. They had survived. They had done their duty. But none of them knew how many more nights like this the war would demand. Or how many they would live to see. The Pacific swallowed the last traces of the ambush. The flames died. The wreckage sank. The waves closed over everything, erasing the battle like ink dissolving in water. Only the memories remained, carried by the men who had witnessed the night the ocean turned into fire. And as Japan's ships disappeared over the horizon, carried gently by the morning tide, one truth settled into their hearts. Victory at sea was never final. Only temporary. The war was far from over. And the Pacific would call them again. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon to watch more videos.